On October 22, 1971, at the Eindhoven University of Technology, two of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century sat across each other to engage in civil debate in front of a live audience. Many topics were discussed, but the main argument centered around one question: is our sense of justice innate or learned? The listeners watched intently as Noah Chomsky and Michel Foucault defended their ideas, with Chomsky insisting that humanity's innate nature is to create and be free, and that society should be decentralized around this truth, while Foucault rejected the notion, arguing instead that justice is not born from nature, but from history and power structures. The two ended up finding some common middle ground in several moments of the debate, such as their critique of big institutions, but still firmly held their opinions without personally attacking one another. It was a rare moment where philosophical ideas were wrestled with publicly in real time, but this type of experience wasn't as rare as you might think. Though the debate wasn't broadcast to the general public, it wasn't uncommon for intellectuals to gather and exchange notions in order to try and progress society. Like the James Baldwin versus William Buckley racial debate in 1965, or Susan Sontag's essays and lectures on photography and nuclear war in the 1980s. Are conversations like this still happening, and if so, where? And is the public intellectual as we know it slowly dying in the digital age, or just evolving into something else entirely? Let's try to answer those questions in this video. I want to begin by saying that a big influence for this video was a Substack essay titled "The Death of the Public Intellectual." I think the author makes some great points that I would have reiterated even if I hadn't read the piece, but there's also some things I don't necessarily agree with, so think of this video as a continuation and critique of that essay. Now, when I say public intellectual, I'm talking about the types of people who write, think, and speak with intellectual depth in order to shape culture and plant fresh ideas into society. And in order to answer whether conversations like this are still happening, we first must examine the main mediums through which these discussions used to take place. It probably won't surprise you that there were two main forms of becoming what people would consider a public intellectual in the 60s, 70s, and 80s: written work or television. And both of these mediums required at least one of two things: high status or high achievement. If your written or verbal work wasn't already popularized, the chances of you being granted access to a stage that broadcasted to potentially millions of people was very slim. The barriers to entry in order to be considered a public intellectual were quite high, and as a result, there weren't that many people we could consider to be extremely influential to our culture, at least intellectually. And though many who passed that barrier held some very controversial opinions, ones that you might even argue set us back instead of moved us forward, they were influential and educated nonetheless. Another barrier that simply couldn't be surmounted if you wanted to dramatically alter public thought was the huge investment of time to craft and refine your ideas. It's a point I touched upon briefly in my last video on literacy, but there were no shortcuts to developing a new line of thinking. You had to consume either lectures or books, which at the very least took days to fully digest, then translate those ideas into your own words and explain in detail what they got right or wrong and why your ideas might be stronger. Take the work of existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. Many consider his book, Being in Nothingness, to be a must-read when first learning existentialism. Being in Nothingness is a dense, 800-page behemoth that took Sartre 2 years of concentrated work to finish, that challenges our notions of God and destiny, arguing that it is up to the individual to create their own meaning. He certainly got lucky in the sense that it was the best time to write about it, given that the Nazis were occupying France and people were losing hope in the idea of a god, but he also wrote plays like No Exit, novels like Nausea, and essays alongside his philosophy, making him one of the most influential thinkers in Paris. This established a sense of authority behind Sartre, and therefore he could frequently be seen hanging with other intellectual elites like Albert Camus and Simone Beauvoir. All of this is to say, you had to earn your right to make a cultural impact through potentially years of arduous academic work. That was the price tag to becoming a cultural vanguard. Now let's contrast that with today. The influence of many public intellectuals has shifted from one of depth to breadth. There's absolutely no shortage of great thinkers out there, but how those thinkers are required to present their ideas has experienced a pretty dramatic change. Maybe you've been trying to tackle your own problems, like the type of career path you want to go down through journaling or some other slow form of thinking, but you need some extra guidance. If you're struggling to find a course of action that helps you create meaning and find that career for your life, then a career coach on Strawberry.me, which is today's sponsor, might benefit you. Career coaches on Strawberry.me are vetted and assessed for their coaching qualifications and expertise and undergo rigorous ongoing evaluations. All you got to do is take a short quiz on their site to get matched with a coach tailored to your needs. And instead of just getting you to talk about your feelings like traditional therapy does, their approach is much more collaborative and action-based, like guiding you through a series of goals while also holding you accountable for them. I hopped on a call with one of the coaches, Dean, and I was impressed at how he was able to ask questions that really got into the root of my problems and empowered me to create the plan to fix them myself. When you have a coach that's actually holding you accountable and giving you direction, that's when you stop the self-sabotaging cycle of going and looking for jobs and applying for a ton of them, getting burnt out, giving up, and then just starting that all over again. If you can't stay motivated, stop trying to go at this alone and try out a coach on Strawberry.me. If you're ready to sign up, you can use my link in the description, strawberry.me/Cole Hastings, or scan the QR code that you see on screen right now. Now, here's what the author of that Substack essay goes on to say. They argue that the people who do shape culture in the present day are not intellectuals, but instead influencers, using Susan Sontag and Hailey Bieber as an example. Writer Susan Sontag was considered a public intellectualist with mass appeal that people looked to get their ideas challenged in the 70s and 80s. And now, the people that would be looking for her are instead just letting someone like Hailey Bieber influence them purely through aesthetics. As the author puts it, we no longer look to those who challenge us intellectually, we look to those who offer us a perfectly packaged lifestyle. I'm not sure I'd really agree with this. I'd argue that by the time Susan Sontag was popular, like the 70s or 80s, the average populace was not seeking someone to challenge them intellectually. I don't think a person like Susan Sontag was the biggest influence on culture. Instead, I think it was, like today, celebrities, or what they're referred to now most likely as influencers. But instead of them being presented through social media back then, it was more so through TV, magazines, and movies. The people most susceptible to seeking out influence from traditional public intellectuals like Sontag are still making an effort to find those people. I truly believe that. The only difference now is, like I said before, that these types of intellectuals are forced to create for a much wider general audience, making their ideas heard more, but not necessarily felt more. I'll explain this further in a moment. And as for the general populace who would have never sought out advice from public intellectuals like Sontag, their ability to comprehend something of the past with that kind of depth might be diminishing, as we now see with the decline in literacy rates. The digital landscape we now live in incentivizes a distinct type of public intellectual, one that, in order to thrive, must grab the attention of as many eyeballs as possible. And there's no better way to do that in social media algorithms designed to exploit human psychology than to provoke. Perhaps one of the best examples of this shift in behavior of public intellectuals is Jordan Peterson. Peterson's lectures when he was a professor in college, which you can easily find on YouTube, represent someone with a deep understanding of psychology and philosophy. He would present ideas from intellectuals of the past in a way that was extremely relevant to our time, which made those videos resonate with a lot of young people, especially young men. But Peterson's real rise to fame was when he stepped outside of the bounds of his practice and debated college students on transgenderism. Peterson was then incentivized to continue going down this sort of path, and when you compare his earlier lectures to how he presents himself today, the content usually leans more towards emotional rather than logical.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating. How do you define the God that you're rejecting?
How do you define worship?
To define God.
Define God.
Define it.
Define it.
We define
that as...
define something. To define worship.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
I can't even fully blame Peterson, nor do I think that everything he talks about in the present is pure nonsense. But now he might be realizing that having your ideas be heard is less about the depth and impact of your words and more about the intensity behind them. Social media algorithms reward extremist emotional behavior, causing a positive reinforcement loop between the creator and the platform. The creator finds that, to a certain point, the more clickbait and fiery words they use, the more people they will reach, which arguably has become the primary motivator for many current public intellectuals. As a result, what we're now seeing is intellectualism being stripped down into a series of self-affirming echo chambers that rarely invite nuance into the discussion. The people now placed on an intellectual pedestal are the ones taking advantage of the nature of short-form platforms. That nature being quick, easily digestible bites of information that lacks the full context of a broader conversation. In the same way that junk food feeds you without nurturing you, these clips give you the feeling that you're engaging with intellectually stimulating thought, but most of the time, they are just feeding your confirmation bias and hindering your ability to take in multiple different perspectives. Now, to defend our points in an argument, whether online or in real life, we're referencing some 30-second clip of a thinker or debater, ignoring any other context and potentially skewing the true intention of the creator's words. It astounds me how many more views these YouTube shorts have with clips of Charlie Kirk debates that use disgusting AI and clickbait to drive engagement, rather than the full debates themselves. And I know someone's gonna distort my words here and act like I'm a Charlie Kirk supporter, and I loved everything he said, when that's obviously not the case. But really, after thinking about it, it doesn't surprise me at all, because this is what our current system incentivizes: exploiting human psychology rather than using it to enrich others. What this creates is a culture whose foundations of intellect are built upon performance rather than pursuit of truth. And we've felt this shift reverberate through our intellectual spaces. Our politicians place more emphasis on presentation rather than enabling any sort of real change. Our education system often focuses more on optics and less on the quality of the education itself, which devalues degrees. And with such a large quantity of influences, thanks to social media and the internet, people have become increasingly confused about who is most trustworthy, who is actually worth listening to, and whose credentials are most valid. So to answer our questions from the beginning, yes, conversations like lectures and debates from the 60s or 70s are still happening, but they're happening through a medium which incentivizes rage and division over deep thought. And as a result, many current public intellectuals, who probably would have developed into what we would have considered a traditional public intellectual, evolved to comply with this change. Does that mean traditional public intellectuals are completely dead? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's the case at all. But their voices might be harder to hear over the convoluted babble of the internet, where so much of our attention is now placed. With that being said, what can we do? Or what can you do as an individual? I always like proposing solutions, even though I am, ironically, guilty of many of the things I just criticized in this video. That doesn't go past me. I think the root of the problem is not so much in the messages currently being pushed to us, but rather the medium of those messages, that being social media, because of what it incentivizes. In order to break this trend, the average populace would need to be incentivized to go elsewhere other than social media, but it is so addictive and rewarding that I don't see that happening anytime soon, unless there's an even greater reward for not being on it, which there currently isn't. But that doesn't mean you have to be this way, and that doesn't mean that there isn't any sort of positive change happening on social media right now. I've started to see public debate in long formats being revitalized on certain podcasts, which is a great sign. And of course, there's an abundance of knowledge you can access for free thanks to the internet. We have never had so many great sources of wisdom we can tap into in almost no time at all, and all of the classic works published by traditional public intellectuals can likely be found online for free with a little bit of digging. It just requires an enormous amount of willpower to resist the internet slop that beckons at you every time you open your phone or computer. The inevitable consequence of the democratization of information and knowledge is that there is now a slew of junk knowledge and vapid information. So what I think will happen for the foreseeable future is exactly the type of inequality being exhibited with the increasing wealth gap and literacy gap in America. The people that do put in the extra effort to seek and comprehend difficult, culturally impactful texts will become smarter than ever, while the people who don't search for intellectually challenging information and never would have even in a different era will, for lack of a better word, get dumber than ever. Choose to climb towards the former and influence others to do the same in any way you can by sharing long-form content, podcast debates, or culturally impactful books, and bring up these ideas in discussion amongst friends. And if you don't have any friends willing to talk about this kind of stuff, you got to put in the effort to find those friends, whether in online spaces or in real life. I promise you they exist, and there are some people like that in my free Discord community. I don't know, that might be a good first place to start, and I'm going to link it in the description anyway. The medium is the message, and by deliberately choosing these types of mediums, you make a pledge to pursue deeper comprehension. Like I said in my last video, the problem now isn't accessing information, but rather having the critical thinking skills needed to discern truth when faced with an abundance of it. We don't have to let these gaps of wealth and intellectual equality continue to widen, and you certainly don't have to be part of the people on the tail end of it. Fight against convenience and speed. Look for the nuance and add positive friction back into your life. Sorry for preaching there at the end. I just really give a shit about this kind of stuff. If you enjoy these types of videos, you'll probably enjoy my last video about literacy rates and the decline in that and what's going on around all that stuff. Go check it out. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.